make him find you because you will be put to work. If Preston has asked if anybody would be interested in starting a bi-weekly, either Thursday or Saturday night student singing down in the student center. If you are interested in that, get with Preston and see if you can liven up some singing and just fellowship together for that. Friday afternoon at 4 p.m. For those that are able, meet in chapel here. As part of Josh's Friday evening thing. Taylor will be leading the session, but it's about, doing Bible studies, sharing the gospel, those kind of things, and then Josh will feed you afterwards. So there's always a prize at the end of this. Then yesterday, we sent out a poll with regards to renovations or changes at the student center. I know that I missed some of you that I did not email. If you did not receive a poll, please let me know that I can add you, that I can send it to you, and you can cast your vote as well. As per normal, tip of the day, if you are ever traveling to go preach somewhere, pack in a clean shirt or a jacket and an extra tie. If you haven't messed anything on you before and had the stress of messing anything on you before having to step into the pulpit to preach, it's not fun. Have a backup. So I think let's start our service.
All right, good morning, everyone. First, before we begin, I want to say thank you for all your prayers and concern for my mom. I've been gone pretty much for about 3 weeks, caring for her. She's still in ICU. She has not woken up yet, but we think she will this week. Hopeful that she will. Everything's coming back online. Her lungs are working like they should. Her kidneys are functioning again, and so it's just a matter of time for her to start coming out of, she's been sedated for so long, it's just going to take a little while. But we think she'll have a full recovery now, and so thankful for all of your prayers and concerns for my mom and our family. So today technically today's not Constitution Day, okay? Constitution Day was Sunday. September 17th, 1787, the Constitution was signed. Goes into effect that fall with elections. Actually goes into effect the next spring, 1788. But we weren't here on Sunday, so we're going to designate Constitution Day here today. For all universities, colleges that receive federal funding, we have to do something to recognize September 17th. And so we typically choose to take this opportunity during our normal chapel time when we're all gathered together to make some kind of presentation. So this will not be a normal chapel, but we will talk about the Constitution, particularly Miranda rights is what we're going to talk about today. So before we begin, let me say I do have 4 pocket constitutions. So first come, first serve if you want to carry one with you. And if you do get arrested, pull it out and make sure you or the arresting officer know your constitutional rights. Hopefully that won't happen. But if you want to carry one in your back pocket or your bag, you're welcome to do so. So come grab one. I'll put them up front. Short video, and then we'll talk about Miranda, okay?
Do you even know the Miranda rights?
Yes.
Let's hear them then.
You got a lot of stuff to do.
Oh, go ahead. You going anywhere, Schmidt? We got time.
I had a thing, but I could probably push it back.
Go ahead. It's 4 declamatory sentences followed by a question for a total of 57 words.
Okay. Look, it obviously starts with you have the right to remain silent. I know you've heard this before. And then, I think it sounds something like, well, the thing, right. You have the right to remain an attorney.
Did you say that you have the right to be an attorney?
You do have the right to be an attorney if you want to.
You say can and will be used against you in a court of law.
He's dead, Murphy.
You have the right to an attorney.
You're reading Miranda to a corpse.
I'm having trouble.
Say I have the right to remain silent. Nobody said I have the right to remain silent.
Donkey, you have the right to remain silent.
What you lack is the capacity.
You have the right to remain silent. Anything you do or say can be used, what's the next part?
As a flotation device.
As a flotation device. Oh, you know what? That's very funny.
It's our duty to inform you of your constitutional rights.
You have the right to remain silent.
You have the right to remain silent.
You have the right to remain silent.
Right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law.
Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court.
Anything you say may be used against you.
say can and will be used against you in a court of law.
You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you at no cost.
You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney.
Remain silent. If you give up the right to remain silent, anything you say can and will be held against you in a court.
You have the right to remain silent and refuse to answer questions. Do you understand? Anything you do say may be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to consult an attorney before speaking to the police and to have an attorney present during any questioning.
Are you sure you understand your rights?
Oh, yes. He explained them to me, just like they do on television.
All right, so before seeing this video, how many of you have heard the term Miranda, Miranda rights, Mirandizing? Okay, pretty much universal, right? And how many of you could state the whole thing because you'd seen it on TV or the movies? Or maybe you're like the folks from 21 Jump Street and you could get maybe you have the right to remain silent and maybe the other parts get jumbled up. So let's talk about Miranda rights for just a second because it is part of our cultural, it's a cultural phenomenon, it's part of our cultural literacy. And we need to think about what this means for our own rights, but generally cultural literacy as well. So let's talk about the two constitutional amendments. Let's talk about constitutional amendments for a second. So the Bill of Rights, first 10 amendments to the Constitution, they are ratified on December 15th, 1791. They are originally proposed as 17 amendments. They get edited, whittled down, combined to 12. And then 10 are actually ratified and become part of the Constitution in 1791. 2 sit out there. They don't have an expiration date. One of them is actually ratified in 1992. It concerns pay for Congress and when that can take effect. And there's one still sitting out there with no expiration date about how big Congress should be based on the population of the United States and that kind of thing. So if you're interested in getting that ratified, it's still out there. It can become part of the Constitution. But the first 10 that get ratified in 1791 are known as the Bill of Rights. And when we think about Miranda, or we think about Miranda rights, there are two related amendments, the Fifth Amendment and the Sixth Amendment. Now, the Fifth Amendment, we're probably pretty familiar with as well, right? Because a lot of times when somebody is asked to testify or they're being questioned, what might they say? I plead the Fifth. And so they're talking about the Fifth Amendment, and specifically one phrase in the Fifth Amendment. I won't read the whole thing. You can see it there. But a person that is called to answer for a capital or infamous crime cannot be made to be a witness against himself or herself, okay? So when you plead the Fifth, what you're saying is, I am choosing to remain silent because I am invoking my constitutional right not to incriminate myself, okay? So that's the Fifth Amendment. And then the Sixth Amendment has to do with criminal prosecutions. And the important part is at the very end as it relates to Miranda, and that is you have the right to be assisted by counsel or an attorney or a lawyer for your defense. So if you are prosecuted, you have the right to. There are actually 9, I think, rights embedded in here, if I count them right. So right to a speedy trial, right to a public trial, right to an impartial jury, right to be tried in the district where you live or where the accusation has taken place or the activity has taken place, to be confronted by your witnesses, to be able to compel witnesses to testify on your behalf, and then the final one, to have an attorney, lawyer, or counsel available at your defense. So let's talk about Miranda. So Miranda takes its name after a young man, Ernesto Miranda. At the time of his arrest for the significant case that we're talking about, he was 23. But he was an indigent, he was poor, poorly educated. He had gotten in and out of trouble in different places in Tennessee, in Nashville, in Ohio. He was born in Mesa, Arizona, even back in his home state of Arizona, kind of in and out of trouble for most of his life, from the time he was a teenager to the time he's in his early 20s. And in 1963, in March, in Phoenix, he's arrested and he's accused of kidnapping and rape of 18-year-old Lois Ann Jameson. Ms. Jameson had identified the kind of car that the perpetrator was driving, and she had also described some aspects about the tag to her brother, who gave that information to the police. Seemed to match what Miranda was driving, and he was arrested. He was actually brought in for a lineup at the beginning of the process, and after the lineup, he came out and he said, "How did I do?" And that got the police suspicious as well. So they arrest him, they bring him into custody, and during that time, it's about 2 hours. It's not too abusive. It's pretty standard questioning during that 2 hours, but during that 2 hours, he confesses to this kidnapping and rape. He writes it out in his own hand, and at the top of every page of his confession, it's stamped that he understands his rights, that his rights have been indicated, and that he understands them. During the trial, his attorney, who's a public defender, gets indication during cross-examination that, in fact, he had not been read his rights, that he had not been told about his right to remain silent, he had not been told about his right to an attorney, so he had not been indicated that he had those Fifth and Sixth Amendment rights. He's convicted for kidnapping and rape solely, basically, on his confession. And you got to think about it. I mean, confession is like the biggest prosecutor's tool, right? I mean, if the person is willing to confess to a crime, then everything else, all the other evidence, everything else is kind of second place to that. And so that becomes a very key part of his trial, and he's convicted basically on that alone, that he had confessed while in police custody and indicated that he knew his rights. But as we indicated during cross-examination, the lawyer for Miranda believes that he had not been read his rights, and they appealed. That appeal reaches the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court decides in 1966 in Miranda versus Arizona that, in fact, he had not been read his rights, that he had not been told about his Fifth Amendment and Sixth Amendment rights during that 2-hour interrogation. And therefore, his confession cannot be a part of the evidence used against him, and so the court rules in his favor, and they reverse the conviction. Okay, that doesn't mean he can't be retried. What that means is that his confession can't be used as the basis for a subsequent trial. So, before Miranda, the Fifth Amendment was believed to basically apply only to judicial proceedings. So when you're in court, okay? So when you're in court, you're being prosecuted for a crime, you are allowed to not speak, you can plead the Fifth, you do not have to testify, and you do not have to incriminate yourself. What the court did, led by Chief Justice Earl Warren, is said, no, Miranda applies not just to judicial proceedings, but it applies to basically any informal process through the beginning when a person is taken into custody or is arrested, all the way through the court proceedings. And what they argued in this 5-4 decision is that the incrimination clause in the Fifth Amendment, that you have the right not to incriminate yourself. Now, you can incriminate yourself if you choose to do so, but you have the right not to do so, that it applied to the police as well. And so this is very important as we think about Miranda rights, because this is when you are in police custody, when you are being placed under arrest, these rights kick in, and this is going to kind of create this cultural phenomenon that we've seen in TVs and movies. There are also 3 other cases going on at the same time that are about the same issue, and they're being appealed, and they sort of get subsumed in Miranda. All 3 of those cases get reversed, those convictions get reversed based on this 5-4 decision with Miranda. Now, when the Supreme Court issues a decision, there will be a majority decision, okay, that will be explained. You can, if you're a justice in the Supreme Court and you are voting with the majority, but you also want to write your own part of the opinion, you can offer what's called a concurrent opinion. So basically you're saying, I'm voting with the majority, I agree with the majority, this is why I'm voting with the majority. If you're voting with the minority, you can have a dissenting opinion. And so typically when the Supreme Court makes a decision, you'll see the majority decision, you'll see concurrent decisions, and then you'll see dissenting or concurrent opinions, and you'll see dissenting opinions. What the Supreme Court also does is they provide a syllabus. Y'all know about syllabi, right? Syllabus, which is basically a summary. For you, what's a syllabus? It's a summary of the course, right? It's a summary of what you're going to be expected to do, what the assignments are going to be, what you're going to cover in the class. The Supreme Court syllabus is the same thing. It's a summary of the opinion, the majority opinion. And in Miranda versus Arizona, the syllabus has 3 important points, okay? The first one is that the Fifth Amendment privilege against self-incrimination has to be safeguarded by the government in some obvious way. Now, they're going to provide an option for the government, but they don't demand that it be done in a specific way, but they say the government has to provide a safeguard for that. Because what they assume is, and we'll talk about this in just a moment, is what they assume is when you're brought into police custody or when you're under arrest, this is an adversarial situation, okay? It's you against the police. It's you against the authorities. And so the government has the responsibility to provide some kind of safeguard to make sure your Fifth Amendment rights are protected. However they choose to do that, they've got to do that. That's the first thing that Miranda says. The second thing that Miranda says is that during this interrogation process, this is the second paragraph, this is, even though the accused, the arrested, the person held in custody has rights, during this interrogation process, it's not intended to in some way hinder other traditional forms of evidence gathering or police work, okay? Because this is what some people are worried about, is it's going to be hard to actually get convictions. It's going to be hard to bring bad folks to trial and conviction and that kind of thing if you have to do all this stuff in the process. So typical things like fingerprinting, or then eventually, not in 1966, but eventually DNA evidence and blood samples and all that kind of stuff, that's not considered a part of Miranda. Miranda, we're just talking about verbal, okay? The verbal statements that a person held in custody or being arrested makes against himself or herself. They've got to be warned. They've got to know their Fifth Amendment rights, just those verbal things, okay? I wish Travis were here. Travis is on a mission trip because he can probably tell stories about this kind of thing. But when you're interacting with someone, as a police officer, when you're interacting with someone, there are all sorts of things that just might happen by just circumstances that don't have anything to do with Miranda, that people might think have to do with Miranda. So, like for an instance, if somebody were pulled over on suspicion that they are driving while intoxicated, okay? And by the way, if you get pulled over, just normal traffic stop stuff, you are not considered under arrest, you're not considered under custody, therefore the police do not have to read your Miranda rights. So if you get pulled over, if you're going out here on Helton and you're going 60 and a 50 or a 60 and a 45 and you get pulled over, the police aren't going to read your Miranda rights, okay? You're not considered under custody, you're not considered under arrest. You do have the right not to talk, okay? But you're not going to be warned because this adversarial sort of situation hasn't developed formally yet, is how the courts have interpreted Miranda. So, but back to the point. So the police have somebody they suspect is maybe driving under the influence of alcohol or drugs. They get them out of the car and they say, hey, can you walk this chalk line? And the person says, well, I couldn't walk a chalk line, when I'm not intoxicated, when I'm not drunk. What have they indicated? That they're drunk. But it has not been by compulsion. It's not been while under formal custody. And so that can be used against that person because they voluntarily gave that information. Okay? And so it doesn't have anything to do with those other aspects of typical police work that we think about. And then the third part of the syllabus is that as we think about statements that are made under circumstances that don't meet constitutional standards, it says, for protection, the idea here is if it doesn't meet a constitutional standard to protect privilege against self-incrimination, what they determined Miranda and the other three cases didn't, those statements can't be used. So those statements can't be used, and the cases have to be reversed. That's basically what the third paragraph says. Now, let's talk about how things developed after Miranda. So his conviction is reversed, but he's put on trial a second time, and his confession can't be used because it was given without him understanding his Fifth and Sixth Amendment rights. He is convicted again. He's convicted, interestingly, based on a statement by his ex-girlfriend who claimed that he had confessed to her that he had committed the crimes. And so again, Miranda only has to do with when you are in government custody, when you're under arrest. It doesn't have to do with what you say to your friends. It doesn't have to do with what you say to your family. It doesn't have to do with what you say when you're not in custody, okay? So she claimed that he told her that he had committed these crimes. She testifies to that in court, and he's convicted. There's really not a lot of evidence that he had committed the crime, but based on that testimony, he's convicted. He's sentenced to 20 to 30 years in prison. He is paroled in 1972. He's arrested numerous times after that. He keeps kind of getting re-released, and in a bar in Phoenix in 1976, he gets to a fight, and he's stabbed to death. One of the things he did after his parole is, and you'll see these, you can see them on eBay, is one of the things that comes out of Miranda is that police departments all over the country basically created cards, okay, Miranda cards for their officers that basically reminded the officers of what they needed to warn the person held in custody or being arrested of their rights, the warnings. And so he would sign these, he would autograph these Miranda rights cards. And I think he typically made like $1, $1.50 for every one he would autograph. So he's doing that in this time, but he's kind of getting in and out of trouble. He ends up getting murdered in 1976. Now, real quick, the time we have left. Before Miranda, this idea of voluntariness was sort of considered the standard, okay? And so the idea was that the court system and the custody and arrest system really is not adversarial, okay? As long as two things aren't happening. As long as you are not being coerced by the physical harm or the threat of physical harm, okay? Or you're not being promised something good, something hopeful. Okay, so think about it. So you're brought in to custody, you're being arrested for suspicion of a crime, and a police officer says, if you don't confess to this crime, we're going to beat you up. Okay? That's illegal before, it's illegal now, it's illegal before Miranda. Okay? That's assumed not to be a voluntary confession. Also, you can't be promised something good. And this happens, you hear about this quite a bit. So you're brought into custody, and the detectives or the police officers, they're questioning you, and they say, Rowan, if you'll just confess, you can go home. If you just confess, this will be all over. You can go home, be with your family. That's a false hope that the police are giving you, and that's not considered a voluntary confession. Okay, that's illegal now. That was illegal before Miranda. But anything else that you say would be used against you if you're not threatened with physical harm or you're not given false hope. It's assumed that everything else you're doing is voluntary. Post Miranda, the idea is this is an adversarial relationship, and the assumption is that everything isn't voluntary unless you are specifically told and you specifically agree that you understand, okay? Because the police aren't looking out for you, the courts aren't looking out for you. You got to look out for yourself, or you need a lawyer or an attorney or a counselor to look after you. And so Warren, in the majority opinion, notes this. He says, today, this is in 1966, then there can be no doubt that the Fifth Amendment privilege is available outside of criminal court proceedings and serves to protect persons in all settings in which their freedom of action is curtailed in any significant way from being compelled to incriminate themselves. So the first thing he says is the Fifth Amendment is not just about in court. The Fifth Amendment applies to any situation in which the government is holding you, where you're not free to leave, your actions are being curtailed, and there's some kind of adversarial relationship that is developed. Warren will argue that this inherently creates anxiety, okay? I've never been, confession time, I've never been arrested. I've never been held in police custody, okay? But I imagine if I were arrested or held in police custody, that would be an anxious moment for me. And so I'm not always going to make the best decisions. I'm not always going to make decisions that are in my best interest if I'm really anxious and if my physical actions are being curtailed. And so Warren argues that the government has to go above and beyond to make sure a person in that situation understands that they have the right for somebody to look after them, and these rights have to be explicitly stated, if that makes sense. So he, again, writes, it is impossible for us to foresee the potential alternatives for protecting the privilege, which might be devised by Congress or the state in the exercise of their created rulemaking capacities. So he says, the government has the responsibility to safeguard these rights and has to do something very obvious and overt to make sure those rights are safeguarded in every situation in which somebody is under custody or under arrest. Warren says, we don't know what the states would do, what Congress might do on a federal level to make sure those rights are protected, okay? So we can't foresee what they might do, okay? They might come up with some other system. They might come up with some other way of protecting those rights, and that's perfectly fine because that's their job. They are in the rulemaking business, and if they want to come up with different rules, they can do it. They just got to do something. Does that make sense? Okay? So, in Miranda, then, in the ruling, he says, here are what we're suggesting, what has to happen, okay, unless the states or Congress decide to do it some other way, okay? Now, again, first of all, this assumes you're in police custody, you are under arrest, or you're under some formal police investigation, okay? All right? So this is not, our typical traffic stop. This is not stuff that you just voluntarily say in the course of a very informal interaction. This is when you're under arrest. Here are your rights under Miranda. I told my kids, I said, so I told Jack and Sydney last night, I said, well, those are my college students, so what have y'all been doing for Constitution Day? And they didn't really remember anything that they had done on September 17th at the various schools they have attended. And so I told them what I was doing, and Jack was like, yeah, is that a big problem at Heritage, students getting arrested? And that you need to warn them about their Miranda rights? And I said, well, I don't think it's a big problem, but if you ever need to use it, here are your rights, okay? So Warren argues, first of all, that you have to be told explicitly you have the right to remain silent. So that's why this is part of TV shows and movies, okay? This is part of the script, all right? Now, you saw in the TV shows and movies, the script varies a little bit, right? It's not always the exact same words, okay? But you need to say something when somebody's being placed under arrest or brought in for formal questioning. They have to be told you have the right to remain silent. So he says this privilege has to be informed or stated. The accused has to be informed in clear and unequivocal terms that he has the right to remain silent. So that's the warning. You have the right to remain silent, but it has to be accompanied with anything. If you choose not to remain silent, Anything you say or do can be used against you in court. Okay? All right? So that's number one. So you have the right to remain silent. The second right that you have under Miranda is that, and this is I've already mentioned this, anything you choose to say can be used against you in court. And so he says, this warning is needed in order to make the accused aware not only of the privilege to remain silent and not to self-incriminate, but also of the consequences of foregoing it. So number one, you need to be told, you have this privilege under the Constitution. You have the right to remain silent. You don't have to self-incriminate. You need to be told what the consequences are if you choose not to remain silent. So sort of like Donkey and Shrek. Some people understand they have the right to remain silent, but sometimes they don't have the capacity to do so. So you have the right to remain silent, but if you choose not to, these are the consequences. And then finally, the third one accompanies it, and that is connecting us to the Sixth Amendment, and that is the right to representation under this adversarial system. So Warren writes, the circumstances surrounding in-custody interrogation can operate very quickly to overbear the will of one merely made aware of his privilege by his interrogators. Therefore, the right to have counsel present at the interrogation is indispensable to the protection of the Fifth Amendment privilege under the system we delineate today. Our aim is to assure that the individual's right to choose between silence and speech remains unfettered throughout the interrogation process. So if you remember back on the video, there are a couple of times where the accused is being told, you have the right to an attorney now. You have the right to an attorney in the presence of, when you're being interrogated, in the presence of questioning. But you also have the right to an attorney throughout the whole process, and throughout the whole process you can say, stop. Okay? So you can agree to maybe start talking to the police, start talking to investigators without an attorney present. But anytime you want to, you need to be informed that you can say, stop, I want to talk to an attorney, I want to talk to a lawyer, I want to bring that person in, tell me out. Those are the three rights that you have under Miranda. Now, they're not on the slide, but real quickly as we close, and I know past time. So Miranda was quite controversial in 1966 when the Supreme Court made this decision. Police jurisdictions around the country are worried, well, what is this going to do to normal sort of police investigative work? How's this going to hinder us in trying to get bad people off the streets? President Nixon uses this as a big campaign issue leading up to the campaign of 1968. He promises to appoint justices that will overturn Miranda. But really, all of this big concern wasn't really too big a deal, okay? Because all Miranda actually did was require that police jurisdictions explicitly state rights. It didn't hinder typical, investigative techniques. It didn't keep you from bringing a bad person in and getting them tried and convicted. Everybody's kind of worried about that, but it really didn't lead to that. But the really interesting thing about Miranda is it's controversial. People think it's probably going to be overturned pretty quickly. But almost right away it becomes a cultural phenomenon. It becomes part of, American culture in the 1960s and the 1970s. So that by, late 60s, TV shows that, Dragnet, for instance, that depicts, police work in Los Angeles, they are directly incorporating this idea of it is our duty to inform you of your constitutional rights. According to Warren, these constitutional rights already existed. It's the police officer's duty to acknowledge those formally for you to make a good decision. It becomes part of the culture so that nobody really thinks about Miranda anymore other than when they're watching a TV show or they're watching a movie. But it is important to recognize that you do have the Fifth Amendment right to speak. First Amendment, you have the right to speak, right? Fifth Amendment, you have the right not to speak. And actually, those two kind of overlap because the right to speak also implies the right not to speak. And so I think that's important for us to remember on this Constitution Day. Thank you for your time and attention, and we'll dismiss to lunch at this time. Thank you.